So one big question that people have is, how do you become creative? And this is a question I get asked a lot, especially on Instagram, which is, Varun, how do I become a creative person? And then they'll take courses, and then they'll look at YouTube videos on how to be creative. But the truth is, creativity comes from a lot of practice and experience. And I'm going to describe how creativity works through an example of a piano player. Assume you want to play the piano, and this is the first time you're ever touching a piano. And you had a teacher, you had, say, a very, very good teacher. This is probably how the teacher will teach you. The first thing you're going to do is learn the actual keys. So you learn how A sounds, you learn how the B key sounds, you learn how C sounds, you learn how C sharp sounds. So you'll know the entire keys. And sometimes with new piano players, experts, they'll take a marker and actually write the letters on the or mark the letters on the keys, just so you're a little comfortable with where the keys are. And then eventually, once you're comfortable with each individual keys or each individual key, you will start learning to replicate simple tunes. So typically at that point, you'll learn how to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or Baba Black Sheep, and these are simple progressions. So you learn how the A key sounds when paired with the B key. You learn how the ABC progression works. You learn how the A to A sharp progression works. So you learn simple progressions. And then, obviously you're looking at a reference, and you're playing according to the reference. And then eventually the reference is taken away, and you're supposed to replicate these simple rhymes on your own. And then once you've mastered the art of playing these rhymes, you're asked to play more and more complex pieces of music. In the first or second year, you'll be playing, popular, say, the American top 40 songs, right? And then eventually you're playing tunes straight from Beethoven 4 or 5 years later. And once you've mastered that is when people start composing music. And if you've ever studied at least these musicians, the way they work is they know now what progressions sound good. So they'll know, okay, A to A sharp sounds really good, so I'm going to put that in my tune. And then they compose a song. But if you've ever looked at amateur composers, people who've just started composing music, a lot of their music is inspired music, right? You can argue that all music is inspired music, but especially amateur composers, they'll take a song that they really like and make a few tweaks to it, such that it sounds different, but it still has a base in an already existing song. And as you get better and better as a composer, as you learn which patterns sound good and which patterns just destroy your ear canal, they start creating longer and longer pieces of original music. And at this point, you can still argue that this music is still inspired. In fact, even the best composers in the world, they often state their inspirations. And especially if you've studied some of these older composers like Bach, you'll see that most of his early music is inspired, and most of his later music is inspired by his earlier music, right? So they start developing a certain style that resonates with the audience, and then eventually it is audience driven, right? Which brings me to the point of creativity, right? To be creative, you first need to learn the building blocks. You need to learn how the building blocks, in this case the keys of the piano, you need to learn those building blocks. You need to learn how those building blocks interact with each other. You need to learn how progressions sound, which are patterns in these building blocks, between these building blocks, and then eventually combine those patterns to make something beautiful, right? So that's creativity, where you can put the same old pieces together in a new way. But you could argue that for you to learn those individual pieces, you first need to replicate other people's work, right? And I've seen something very similar in my progression through, say, design. When I first started Photoshop, I spent, I think, the first 2 or 3 weeks just learning how to create shapes, right? How to use the pen tool, how to use the individual tools. But I never really understood those tools, right? I never really understood each and every one of those tools or their full potential of versatility. But once I started replicating other people's work, and that happened, I think, in month 1 or month 2, where I started, copying simple stuff from Dribble and Behance. And that's when I said, okay, I went to YouTube, I'd look up a tutorial, and that's one of the key things I feel when you're looking up something with design or music. You need to know the words for it, right? So, for example, if I want a weathered poster effect, I know exactly what to look for, because when I see somebody else create a weathered poster effect, I know what it's called. But the biggest problem people have is they look at something and they don't know what it's called, so they can't actually Google it and look up a tutorial on it. But then what I did was I looked up these tutorials and I copied it I just looked at the tutorial and did exactly what the tutorial said I should do. And then I tried to replicate it without the tutorial, right? So same thing that I created looking at the reference, and then I removed the reference. And then eventually I realized, okay, if I want to create a weathered poster effect on Photoshop, here are the steps I need to go through. Here are the tools I need to use. If I want to create, say, a simple icon or a character in Photoshop, here are the steps I need to go through. And then eventually, once I got pretty good at the software, once I could create a lot of or replicate a lot of other people's stuff, I started taking inspiration from experts. I looked at Mike from Creative Mints. I think he's one of the best designers I've seen out there. I looked at his work and I said, okay, can I replicate this? And then I spent some time replicating that. And then once I was able to replicate his work without reference, that's when I started tweaking stuff. So even today, when I do design, I look at, I go to Dribbble, I just look at some inspiration, I look at 2 or 3 things, and then I say, okay, I probably want this from this, I want this from this, and the end goal, or what I end up creating, is an amalgamation of 2 or 3 things that I've seen out there, and then I add my own flavor and touch to it, because I have something in my mind, and then I get there eventually through putting those individual pieces together, and that is creativity, right? Because those tweaks that I make, those variations that I make, some variations are terrible and some variations end up doing really well. So those tweaks, those variations are where creativity comes from. And as I get better at the craft, I'm able to make better variations that the audience responds to better, right? Things that actually end up looking good. And that's it. That's exactly where creativity comes from. So if you want to be a creative person, you need to get really good at what you're doing first. Learn the basic blocks, learn individual patterns. In my case, in Photoshop, I learned the weathered poster effect. That was one pattern. I learned the individual tools and sequence required to pull off that pattern. And once I got good at the pattern, I use that effect very often these days, right? And that's just one pattern in my arsenal. And I have hundreds, if not thousands, of different patterns that are in my head. And even if they're not in my head, I know what to look for on Google so that I'll be able to replicate that pattern at will. So that, and then that's where I put in my variations and my tweaks. So that's creativity, guys. Just get experienced, learn the building blocks, learn the patterns, and learn to put it together in new ways after you replicate a few other things. So that's about it for creativity. Hope you learned something from this episode. Catch you on the next.